Technology can be liberating, but it can also be used to track, monitor, contact, harass, and worse. And it's now cropping up in cases of violence against women. Joining us now for more, Kate Robertson, criminal defense lawyer at Marks & Law and a fellow at the University of Toronto Citizen Lab. And Takara Small, tech journalist and the founder of the nonprofit Venture Kids Canada, which mentors youth in underserved communities in coding and entrepreneurship. Welcome to you both. Nice to meet you.
Same to you. Thank you.
Kate, I would like to start with you. When we talk about smart abuse, what are some of the ways women's privacy is being violated through technology?
Well, sadly, Nam, there's a number of ways that can happen. Sometimes technology can enable similar types of abuse and harassment that we see in the real world, interpersonal types of contact that happens between intimate partners, and usually it happens along gender-related lines to women and young girls or children.
So this is men targeting women, like their partners or children?
Disproportionately, yes, it tends to fall along those lines. Of course, there's exceptions to that general statistic, but it tends to be a type of abuse that women and children experience disproportionately. And then sometimes there's ways in which technology has allowed new and novel types of abuse to happen in ways that aren't comparable to real world, non-tech related abuse.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there's certain types of information that we have now stored in digital devices in ways that truly is unprecedented, and it reflects the extent to which technology is really a seamless part of our day-to-day lives. And so, for instance, there's types of abuse that is unprecedented in a similar way, such as the fact that we now have quite a bit of deeply private personal information, such as images or videos that are stored in our devices or the devices of our intimate partners who individuals expect to trust and to hold that information in confidence. But there's ways in which that information, access to that information, is exploited in an intimate partnership. And so that has resulted, for instance, with a type of offense that's now under Canadian criminal law called the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, and colloquially speaking, that's often referred to as a revenge porn offense, where an intimate partner either threatens to disclose private sexual images or recordings, or discloses them and distributes them on social media or other platforms without the consent of the person who's the subject of those recordings.
We're going to talk more about revenge porn in a few minutes, but I want to get more into how this happens. We were talking about the Netflix show called You, and the whole premise of the show is that this person starts stalking a woman with the information that he finds about her online. It's kind of like we're leaving little breadcrumbs on the internet, and then people use it in ways to target us. Takara, in your reporting, what are some of the stories that you've heard of how women are being targeted through technology and so-called smart abuse?
Yeah, it's a situation that I think mimics what you'd find in a Hollywood thriller. It's hard to realize that this is happening in real life. And with the reporting that I did, I found when I was talking to a lot of domestic shelters, a lot of social workers, that there are women who find themselves in a precarious situation because their smart thermostat or their smart speakers or their smart locks that protect themselves inside their homes are being abused by most of the time by men, and there's very little recourse for them, especially because it's not something that's talked about a lot.
And that's the article that you wrote recently for Refinery 29 titled How Smart Home Systems and Tech Have Created a New Form of Abuse. Like someone hearing what you just said might think, well, why don't you just unplug the device? What's preventing that simple act from being the solution to this problem?
Right, and it's something that I've heard from a few people online. Why don't these women just unplug their devices or sign off? And the tricky part about that is because a lot of the time with smart devices, these accounts aren't held in their name. So it's incredibly challenging to call up a technology company and say, I'd like to no longer use this service, or I'd like it to be removed, which also comes with a financial penalty. And for women who are in abusive situations, they often don't have the ability, the money, either to pay for those to be removed or the account details, which is the scary part because your home is supposed to be a safe place. It's the one place you're supposed to be able to feel secure secure. And with smart abuse, it takes that away from you with no recourse. It's hard to go to the police because this is a subject that hasn't been delved into. It hasn't been researched as much as physical or sexual violence, which I think people are more familiar with.
Can you explain to someone who's watching this how a thermostat can be used to harass somebody in their own home?
Yeah, so while researching this story, for instance, I came across one account where a woman in the middle of the night, her abusive partner, who was banned from the home, would wake up in the middle of the night because the thermostat would be turned up to 90 degrees Celsius. So imagine going to bed with normal temperatures and then waking up, sweating without any recourse to turn the temperature down. Or in another instance, a woman would go to bed and in the middle of the night, she would have punk screaming music blaring from her smart speakers. And for many of these women, they felt, okay, this must be a mistake with either my device, my Wi-Fi, or something that I've been hacked. But because it's the symptoms or the issues you face are very hard to determine, they didn't realize, unfortunately for a while, that it was actually their partner.
And it's hard to call the police and say someone's playing music and turning it off and on.
Yeah,
right?
Imagine calling the police and you saying, my speakers keep playing loud music in the middle of the night. I don't know what to do. It's a really, I think, odd situation to place yourself in, but you are a victim nonetheless.
And Kate, this isn't the only way technology is being used to harass women. We should also talk about spyware. How is spyware becoming an increasing concern?
There are a range of ways that technology can fall within the nexus of intimate partner abuse that Takara is describing. And that's because there's a range of technologies that can either be intentionally or unintentionally exploited. Sometimes there's technologies that we think of as otherwise very innocuous in our day-to-day lives that because they're designed in a certain way that isn't perhaps sensitive to the potential for abuse, to access information, there could be considered dual-use software.
For example, like someone might get spyware or monitoring software to make sure that their child gets home safely. Or if you're at home and you monitor your home to make sure your home is secure. Is that what you mean? And then
yes, yeah, and there's a lot of technology that we use in our day-to-day life that we don't ordinarily associate with that type of abuse, but it can be and is susceptible to being used in that way. There's other types of commercially available spyware programs that are designed very much for the predominant purpose of surreptitiously being installed on someone's device, and it allows the person who's installed that device or program on the device to monitor the person's electronic life remotely through their own computer or cell phone. And so it would operate in secret on the back of your cell phone without the person even being aware of it.
And I was reading too that all the person needs sometimes is just your number. They don't actually have to put it physically on the phone, and they can monitor your devices. So you don't even know. The types of programs that are available right now, generally it requires the person who's installing the program to at some point have access to the physical device. But there's other types of cloud-enabled technologies where if you have the password to the person's cloud, then there's other types of intimate information that can be tracked, or location tracking, a whole host of surveillance opportunities that the person who's using this type of technology has no appreciation. They're relinquishing that control over that information. And just to pick up on location tracking, Takara, how can that be used to physically stalk someone?
Right. It's very easy because geo-tracking devices have also gone down in price, and they're a lot smaller, which makes it harder to detect. It's easy for individuals or abusive partners to track where their partner is, either through phone or by actually physically planting a device on them. And so you can purchase right now, I mean, it's out of this world how easy it is to purchase a tracking device. And that allows the individual to not only know where they go, but also to see who they're meeting with, which is troubling because a lot of these women are looking for support. So if they go to the police or a shelter, et cetera, it enables the abusive partner to understand and think about ways to thwart any type of support they need.
How about when you tag your photos online and say you're here or there?
Yeah.
It's such an innocent thing to do, but how can that have really bad ramifications?
Yeah, and it goes back to what we were talking about, Hollywood thriller. Like, I always suggest that not even just women, but anyone, they remove any geolocation tracking from photos. And when they're out somewhere, they don't give away information about where they are, who they're seeing, et cetera. Just to be smart, especially if you're a woman or a person of color or a visible minority, there are just so many ways that anyone who has access to your account or following you, et cetera, can use that to harm you.
And the companies that are selling, like I went on, to get ready for this interview, I went on Google Play and I went on Apple to see how, if I can find this information, like these these things that you can use for spyware, right?
Yeah.
But for the companies that are selling this software, what is their legal responsibility, Kate, in ensuring that the product isn't abused and that people are protected from its uses?
Well, Nam, that's a big ticket question with a complicated answer. But in general terms, when we're talking about different types of programs, particularly programs that by design are intended to operate surreptitiously without the person whose personal information is tracked by the program, the company that's generating these programs and selling them has the potential to face a liability in a number of ways, whether it's under criminal law, privacy legislation, or civil or regulatory laws that do exist in Canada or various provinces. It really does depend on the circumstances and the capability of the particular program. But this isn't something that's been extensively considered in Canadian courts or under Canadian laws directly per se yet.
Has it been considered anywhere else in the world, or is this something that's just so new, we're just kind of learning as we go?
There's quite a bit of research and legal analysis that is going on internationally as well as in Canada as we're beginning to understand the full scope of the problem. But I would say that it's it would be wrong to assume that because a program of that capability is available for sale, that it is necessarily lawfully available, or that it would be lawful to use the program. It would be analogous to saying, well, because I can purchase a gun, it would be lawful for me to use it. There's a number of laws that the person who purchases and uses programs like that may also be liable under, including the criminal law, depending on the function of the program.
Right.
And when people buy this software, do they know that?
Well, there's under criminal law terms, there's a rule in our justice system that ignorance of the law is not a defense. And so to the extent that there are criminal laws that do prohibit that type of behavior, everyone is presumed to be aware of them. But there are no express warnings necessarily that would be flagged when someone would see an app or a program available in their Apple store or whichever other source that they get their cell phone apps from. And so that's something that individuals will want to be very wary of.
Well, we know that if you open someone's mail, it's a federal offense. What about if someone opens your emails? What's the law surrounding that?
Well, there's certainly express laws, as you mentioned, that govern and regulate, including through criminal offenses, access to physical mail. That's been longstanding in our system. There's not as express laws that govern access to email communications or other communications, but there's a number of criminal laws that have the potential to be engaged in those circumstances. And that could include identity fraud, unauthorized use of a computer, or where someone gains access to someone else's communications platform if they manipulate access to the person's own communication, such as through deleting or interfering with what emails they're sending or receiving and that kind of thing. But it very much depends on a number of circumstances. But I think that as a society, many people appreciate, morally speaking, that you're crossing a moral boundary when you pick up someone else's phone or their computer without their authorization. But it may not be as clear for a lot of individuals that there's a number of laws that do have the potential to apply when someone takes those steps.
And I'm thinking too, I don't know if that would be a deterrent if someone is in a moment when there's so much emotion involved, right, Takara?
Right. Yeah, it's a very, like, as Kate mentioned, it's a very complicated situation. When in regards to spyware or applications that use geo-tracking, it's also important to note that there are apps that are designed for use with real applicable reasons. So, for instance, there are a lot of parents who use those type of apps for their children to track where they are, to ensure they're safe to and from home, and there are some that are like entirely focused on parents who have Alzheimer's to ensure that they know where they are, et cetera. So I think the issue is when those apps are being misused or abused. So just because those apps are available, it doesn't necessarily mean that someone who's using it is using it for nefarious reasons as well.
Both of you, we're running out of time. I wish you had more time, but what would you say are the most important tips, tools, resources you can share that can help women better protect their digital privacy? Kate?
Well, the trouble with this area of the law as well as technology is that it can be very difficult to detect for both the person who's using the device as well as for third parties that they may seek out help from, such as law enforcement, to really see at first glance what is going on with their devices and who's using their personal information in what ways. But the fact that you may be experiencing unusual behavior relating to someone else's apparent access to your private information, there's certain cues that tend to come up over time. And so having a public education as to the potential for this problem is an important part of the discussion, because there are a range of legal protections and remedies that are available, including through the criminal justice system as well as other areas of the law. And if someone does feel unsafe or concerned about whether or not there has been invasion of their privacy with or without their knowledge, they can contact the authorities and seek out help. But there's also, if there's difficulty obtaining access through those channels, there's other sources of protection that are available. Sometimes that includes seeking out the help of a lawyer, or there's also protection orders or restraining orders, as people often understand them to be, that are available through the criminal courts that are intended to prevent harm from coming to fruition when someone has a fear that their safety is in jeopardy in some way. And so there's certain proactive steps that can be taken to address a dangerous situation before it gets to the point where something further, such as physical or an actual violation of privacy, such as the revenge porn type context, actually comes to fruition.
And Takara, women's shelters are doing something else to keep women safe. What are they doing?
Yeah, so a lot of women's shelters are incredibly digitally literate. So what they're doing is they have buttons on their website to erase browsing history, so that if there is an abusive partner who has access to your phone or your computer, et cetera, it will erase that, and it'll ensure that you're able to view that information on an ongoing basis, which I think is really important, and one of the biggest things that any woman or person in general who is fearful should do. And another one I always say is everyone should track and record any instances where they feel potentially that there has been an abuse of technology. So if you're in your home and you're experiencing weird situations, you should make sure to track what time, exactly what occurred, so that if you do go to the police, you have a record. Additionally, you should contact the companies that produce the device as well, so that you can say, okay, I've gone to the company, they say this isn't normal for the behavior of my device, smartphone, smart thermostat, et cetera, to be acting like that. And that way, if anything does happen, you contact a lawyer, you have proof. There is undeniable proof that this has been going on, and you can, work with an official to find some resolution.
Well, thank you very much to you both. We've run out of time. Thank you for being on TVO and helping us understand smart abuse better. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.